Just because it has skin and teeth and likes to walk on 2 legs doesn't make it human. Even if it speaks, even if it knows your name, even if it reaches out to you with 5 fingers, don't take its hand, don't answer it, because there are things in this world that only look like people. These are humanoids, and what you're about to hear are allegedly real humanoid encounters. Get ready to feel terrified, and be sure to send me your stories for a future episode at darkstories.org. I'd love to hear more stories from Africa. If you want to listen to my show while you work, jog, sleep, or drive, search for and follow the Darkness Prevails podcast on Spotify or iTunes, and leave a review on iTunes too, if you can. Thank you. Now, let's begin. The Thing in the Back Seat. From Anonymous. I was 7 years old. I was in the car with my mother and my brother, who was 3 years older than me. I can't recall much of the specifics, but I do know we were on our way to a beach in Texas, all the way from our home in Oklahoma. It would be a long ride, but it gave me a chance to play some Mario on my Game Boy Advance. Well into our journey, maybe 4 or 5 hours down the road, my mother pulled us into a rest stop for an emergency bathroom visit. I didn't really need to go, but both my mother and brother could not wait any longer. My mom was even so desperate to go to the bathroom that she asked me permission first, as she didn't want to leave me in the car for very long. I just nodded and said, "It's okay," and the 2 of them took off. I think they were only gone for a few minutes. It was sundown, and there were no other cars in the lot. Given that situation, I can't really blame my mom for running off to the bathroom. So while they did their business, I sat there struggling to get the last bits of sunlight to hit my Game Boy Advance screen. Before I realized how hopeless the cause was, a sudden sound from behind me caused me to jump. It was the sound of the trunk to my mother's SUV opening up, then quickly shutting. Seemingly automatically, I turned my head to see who had opened the trunk. What I saw when I turned my head was nothing, but I did hear something stirring around in the seat and in the floor. I began to unfasten my seatbelt so that I could stand up and get a good look at what was in the back seat. Whatever it was had managed to close the trunk behind it. It couldn't have been an animal, so I thought it was my brother crawling back there to find something or even to scare me. The moment I began to tinker with my seatbelt, a voice whispered from behind me, "Stay put." Something had told me to stay put, just as a child would do. Nonsensically and reflexively, I replied with, "Why?" It didn't take long for the thing to respond. "You'll get in trouble." Well, they did have a point. If I started climbing over the seat or getting out to go to the trunk, my mom would be mad. She would want me to stay put, to stay safe. So I listened and let go of my seatbelt. "Okay, who are you?" I asked. "Starving." I think it said starving. I suddenly felt bad. Sure, I wanted to see who was in the car with me, but I was an easily distracted kid, and a compassionate one at that. "Oh, I know." I leaned forward, stretching out my little arm and grabbing my baby bottle pop that my mom had gotten me at the last gas station. I unscrewed the top, then dipped it into the little cup, covering the hard candy part in powder. I remember thinking how much my little friend in the back was going to love this, 'cause baby bottle pops were my favorite candy. I then turned around, trying to reach my hand over the back of the seat so my friend could have some candy. But my arm wasn't long enough, and they didn't want me out of my seatbelt, so I wasn't sure at first how to get my candy to the back seat. I peered down and to the left. I was facing the middle seat in the middle row of the SUV, the spot we never used or sat on. It was then that I looked through the opening between the seats, and I found an eye looking back at me, never blinking, A dark black eye. I couldn't find pupils in those eyes. The skin around them was sunken in and extremely pale. Reminded me of my older brother when he stays inside all summer playing video games, but this was much worse. As I recall it now, so many years later, I swear I could see veins throbbing under the skin. After I was done observing my friend, who was apparently lying on the back floorboard, I began to stick my hand with the baby bottle pop in it through the crack towards my friend. The opening was big enough that I could still see what my friend was doing. He began to open what appeared to be his mouth. The way that mouth looked to me, it terrified me even then, shoving all my innocence and trust and carefree attitude to the side. I was overwhelmed with horror in that moment, because I had never seen teeth so sharp or so numerous in a person's mouth. The teeth were yellowed and disgusting to look at, broad at the roots and thinned out at the top, looking more like fat daggers than anything else. I stopped reaching forward with my candy when I saw that, and at that age I didn't have the foresight to pull my hand back. I watched as this mouth approached my hand. My young mind was filled with thoughts about how much this was going to hurt. A kid should never be put in that situation. Suddenly, the door beside me opened. "What are you looking at, you goob?" My older brother climbed back into his seat on the opposite side of the middle row. My mom was entering the car too, beginning to sit down and buckle up in the front seat. In that instant, I had yanked my hand out from the crack, and all I could do was stare at my brother, shaking my head over and over. "Okay." My brother smirked, obviously confused at my reaction. My head shot forward and I stared at the seat in front of me. My little heart was pounding when I looked down at my feet, which were hanging several inches above the floor. I was a short kid after all. I saw that they were shaking. Remembering that you can climb under these seats to get to the back, I yanked my legs up onto the seat. "Honey, no feet in the seat, please." My mother reprimanded me, her eyes catching mine in the rearview mirror. I whimpered out, My legs hurt." As she pulled into reverse, she sighed, then relented. "All right, just take your shoes off at least, okay? I know you were splashing in the mud before we left, and I don't want the seats all dirty." I was so relieved. I quickly threw my shoes off. They fell to the floor below me. We took off back down the highway. My brother soon fell asleep, and my mom was solely focused on the road. I was insanely tired, but I didn't want to shut my eyes long. After all, my friend was still in the car. At one point I did glance towards the opening in the seats, but I did not see his face. Only when I felt breathing on my right elbow did I know where my friend was. He was crouched in the floor right behind me. I knew if I looked through the opening to my right, between the wall of the interior of the SUV and my seat, I would see his eyes and maybe even his mouth. So once again, I looked straight ahead, and I didn't turn for a while. For the next hour, I distracted myself from my new companion by wondering how I could get my mother's attention, to make her aware of this thing in the back seat, to make everything better without risking any of us getting hurt. But I was too panicked, too nervous, too little to think of anything at all. Suddenly, I saw movement below me. In the floor just in front of me, my shoes were moving. It took me a few seconds to see through the dark that there was a long and thin finger in each of my shoes, pulling them under the seat into the back seat behind me. I was trembling again. Once I could no longer see the shoes, I heard a sniffing sound, followed by a voice.
"Child's flavor."
At first, I couldn't understand what he said, but then it came to me. Child's flavor. Suddenly, there was a sharp sting in my right arm. I yanked away and looked over, only to find a bony hand with long, pale, and sharp fingers had been poking into me. The last thing I heard him say was this:
"Next, stop."
That one was clearer. Next, stop. My young self could no longer contain or cope with the amount of terror that I was feeling. I screamed so loud and so suddenly, my mom nearly wrecked. She slammed on the brakes, turning the steering wheel to the right, trying to maintain control of the now sliding vehicle. She managed to realign the car with the road, but not before the man in the truck behind us plowed into the back of the SUV because we had slowed down so suddenly and so quickly. When we came to a complete stop, my mom spun around in her seat to look at me. I was in tears and holding my arm still from the sharp finger. I could tell she was furious at first, but seeing me so scared and thinking I'd hurt my arm in the wreck, she donned an expression of concern. She threw off her seatbelt, opened the door, then ran over to my side. She opened my door and tried to ask me if I was okay and look me over, but all of that was interrupted when a sickeningly pale and thin figure crawled and threw itself from the back seat. My friend flew past us. It was out the door, past my mom, and scurrying away through the trees near the road in a matter of seconds. What the? My mother cursed in front of me. She held her hand to her heart, obviously as surprised as I was. The man who had hit our car from behind had already gotten out of his truck and was approaching my mom to see if we were okay. Luckily, he wasn't mad. He was close enough to see something fly out of the car. He ran up to my mom and asked if she needed help getting her dog back. I remember this part extremely clearly. She looked at the man and replied, "We don't have a dog." My mother truthfully admitted fault in the accident, explaining to the man that I had screamed in my seat, causing her to freak out. The man was understanding and patient. They traded information, reported it to a police officer, and before long we were on our way. We made it to our destination in Texas just fine, and the trip back was uneventful, thank God. Though my mother would ask me from time to time if I remembered what was in the back seat, and as a kid, I would just shrug. I would respond, "I don't know," because I really didn't. I've talked about this with my mom now that I'm older. I've told her the whole truth, the whole thing, what I'm telling you now. But I'm not sure she believes me. She thinks I was just scared that a wild animal crawled into the car, that my memories are fuzzy and I'm trying to piece things together to make sense of how scared I was back then. And you know what? She's wrong. Though I wish she was right, I remember it all too clearly. Now I know when I'm a dad, I won't be leaving my kids alone in the car for even a second, at least until they can drive. Childhood Encounter from Anonymous. When I was a little girl, around 5 to 6 years of age, I lived with my mother in my great-grandfather's house. I can state with conviction that this house was indeed haunted, and I had numerous encounters with beings not of this world. Being as young as I was, I had no prior knowledge of ghosts, spirits, demons, and I was never exposed to films or tales of this nature. I could not imagine the terrifying events that regularly happened to me. One occurrence that still affects me even today is being awakened in the middle of the night by banging noises coming from my wardrobe in the corner of my bedroom. I remember feeling confused at the sounds, wondering if my cat was somehow locked inside there. As I lay in my bed, I heard the wardrobe door creak open, and I witnessed a short, dark humanoid figure slowly step out. This figure was horrific. It was about 2 feet tall. It had long, scraggly hair, long, spindly arms, and glowing red eyes. I was too scared to move, and I couldn't shout out for my mother either, as the only sound I could manage to make was a pathetic, whimpering whisper. This thing then appeared to stare at me, and I recall that its gaze filled me with a stone-cold dread. It proceeded to take an extraordinarily long step, and was now instantly looking over me, leaning lower and lower until I could feel its foul-smelling hot breath on my face. I was feeling total panic, and I remember wetting myself. I was so scared. This thing then wrapped its ice-cold, bony hand around my arm and began to pull me out of my bed. I resisted, trying to pull my arm back, but it had me in a tight grip, and I felt myself being dragged onto the floor. The thud of me landing on the floor must have awakened my mother, as I heard her walking towards my room. It was at this point that I finally found my voice, and I began to scream and yell for help. The instant she started to open my bedroom door, the hideous figure seemed to melt and slip under my bed. My mother was furious that I'd awakened her, and accused me of messing around. When she picked me up off the floor to return me to the bed, she discovered that I'd wet the bed, and she went ballistic, refusing to listen to me at all when, between sobs, I tried to tell her about the thing under my bed. I don't think I managed to fall back to sleep that night, and I just remember lying there, listening to the noise it made. In the morning, I had marks on my arm from where it grabbed me, and they looked as though they'd been burned into me by something hot. I had many more encounters with it over the next few years, but none as terrifying as that night. To this day, I still cannot sleep without a light being on. Jinn Encounter, from Decca. I was born in Djibouti, a small country located in Northeast Africa. I was only 4 years old at the time. My mother took me to dinner at her friend's house. After dinner, my mother's friend had a daughter that was the same age as me. I forgot her name, but let's call her Zara. Zara and I were playing around the house, just doing what kids normally do, such as playing with toys or playing hide and seek. Zara wanted to go use the restroom. I went along with her. We get to the bathroom and we started to play with makeup. We were combing each other's hair when, out of the corner, I saw a small-looking man coming out from the toilet. I was confused. I just thought it was some sort of construction worker. But how did he even come out through the toilet? There's no way a grown human being could come out of a small toilet like that. I looked at the small man. From what I can remember, he reminded me of a little person, and his face looked really depressed. He didn't even look at me or acknowledge me, but I was looking at him so confused. My young mind was racing. I was also shocked about what I was seeing. The little man went back into the toilet and disappeared. I looked over at Zara, but Zara wasn't paying attention. I asked her, "Did you see that?" She responded, "Don't worry about that. It's a djinn. They can take the form of a small man." I didn't even know what to say at that point. So we get out of the bathroom and we go outside to play. When it was time to go home, I told my mom about the encounter. But my mom wasn't surprised. She told me that there was a djinn living in that bathroom, but it doesn't like to bother anyone. My mom told me that djinns are attracted to dirty bathrooms, which might explain why there was a djinn in there. Zara's house was an old house. Needless to say, I never went back to her house. I haven't seen Zara in 24 years. I live in the United States now. That was a memory of a Jinn encounter that I would never forget. Was it a Wendigo? From G. Dark Knight. I was a 14-year-old guy from western North Carolina. This story takes place near Roan Mountain, Tennessee. It was December 2019 when I believe I saw a Wendigo watching me. It started late night a week before Christmas. I was sitting on my porch, waiting for my mom to come stargazing with me. It's something that my mother and I have always enjoyed doing together. She was in her bedroom at the moment, which was adjacent to the porch. I was sitting on the porch, waiting for her around 10 o'clock at night. I then heard some rustling by a large bush. Of course, I looked over there. I was met by two huge red eyes. They were about 4 feet off the ground. I stared at those eyes for what felt like an eternity. All of a sudden, those eyes began to rise. I knew then that it wasn't something small that I was looking at. It was something huge. It walked out of the bush, and it seemed to be 7 feet tall. I'm around 5'10", and I had to look up at this thing. We must have been no more than 25 feet apart. This creature had pale skin, large claws, matted black hair and patches, and it was staring at me still. A moment passed, and it began to let out a low growl. Then it took 3 steps towards me. I'm not sure if it was a he or a she, because I didn't see any parts, but it was built like a human man. I felt nothing but fear in that moment. For some unknown reason, it just turned away from me and walked in the opposite direction, as if nothing had happened. It was just going to leave, go back home, go to the store, something else mundane. That's how it acted. It walked behind my great-uncle's barn and disappeared. The following day, I went to where it was. I found footprints bigger than my hand, but they stopped at the barn. I still sit on that porch at night from time to time, but I haven't seen anything like it since. I'd always heard of the Wendigo coming from Cherokee descent, although I never thought I would see one for myself. If you're ever near Roan Mountain, Tennessee, be wary of what's in those woods, because you never know what you might see. Something on the Ceiling, from Yuiscrib. A few years ago, when I would have been somewhere between 17 and 19, I was staying at my partner's place on my night off. We often played video games and watched movies together till late at night, sometimes as late as 2 a.m., before we'd curl up and sleep next to each other in the bed. On this particular night, I woke up while it was still dark out, and I saw something on the ceiling. The room was so dark that it mostly looked like a patch of ceiling darker than the rest, except sort of like a lanky, crouched humanoid. My heart instantly began to hammer, as all I could do was lie there and stare at this dark shape directly above me. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. It was like one of those nightmares where no matter how hard you try, nothing will come out of your mouth. I couldn't even alert my boyfriend, sleeping peacefully, unaware, beside me. I wanted to attempt to keep him safe at least, but I couldn't. I'm sure I even remember it beginning to reach down towards us. This is where it gets blurry, because at some point, I finally began to scream. My boyfriend was startled awake and tried to ask me what was wrong. He tried to hold me and shake my arm, but I couldn't stop screaming. I eventually even forgot why. He got up and turned on the light, and at some point I did stop. The dogs on the street were all barking, and I'm surprised the neighbors didn't call the cops. But for a while there, for at least the rest of the next day, I couldn't for the life of me figure out why I was so panicked in the first place. Once I had stopped, it was like I was in a confused daze. I'd even asked him why he looked so worried. I forgot I'd even been screaming for a good few seconds. But once I did remember it all, it became so vivid. Paranormal encounter or sleep paralysis, I don't know. All I do know is that I was seriously terrified, and I hope it never happens again. It follows from Souissi. I have several encounters, if you may, with this creature that has followed me for a while, if not my entire life. I'm a healthy 27-year-old from Tunis, North Africa, and this encounter happened about 2 years ago. On one occasion, I was walking alone late at night. It must have been 3 to 4 a.m. I enjoy late-night walks. I suddenly got the feeling that there was something in the empty street with me, something following me. But it was smart. It synchronized its steps with mine. I began getting this feeling of uneasiness crawling all over my body, so I sat on the sidewalk, pretending to be resting for a bit, while trying to catch a glimpse of whatever or whoever it was. To be honest with you now, I was scared to death. I saw this humanoid figure. It was about 1.8 meters tall, with a slender yet muscular body, for lack of better terms. It had these animalistic features like pointy ears, long fingers with what appeared to be sharp claws, and skin that looked to be a mixture between scales and fur. It was dark in color. I don't mean just standing in the dark. I mean it was so dark, as if it was absorbing all the light that was in the street. I won't lie, I began having that feeling of primal fear. Something in me knew that I was in danger. But I didn't run. Perhaps it was pride, but I don't run from anything. So I took off my headphones, and I kept walking, as if I never saw it, though I could feel it getting closer to me, all the way until I made it to my house. I stood at the door and looked behind me. It was standing no more than 20 meters away behind me. It just stood there, and it waved at me. It's safe to say that I did not sleep well that night. Not out of fear alone of the encounter, but when I revisited my memories, I realized that this creature has followed me for a while now, but this was the first time I really noticed it. The Screams in the Forest of Western New York, from Djrusz. This happened about 2 weeks ago. I was at my family reunion in Western New York. For context, my family owns a huge plot of land, including a valley and a full hill. If you live in New York, you know how big the hills are. Well, on to the story. My aunt owns a fishing pond, and one of the days of our week-long family reunion, I decided to go fishing. Now, it takes time to walk the roads to the pond, as it's basically in the middle of nowhere. The trail down to the pond is narrow and surrounded by forest. The road by the trail is surrounded by a huge amount of pine trees. I walked down the trail with my fishing gear. Once I arrived, I began fishing. In about 20 minutes, I caught about 4 fish. Out of nowhere, there came a scream, almost like a fox scream, but more human than that. This scream was followed by a rustling in the bushes around the pond. Kind of curious and kind of creeped out, I figured it was time to head back. I began to reel in my line, catching one more fish, but then the screams get louder and louder, followed by more heavy rustling. I get my new catch off the hook as fast as possible. Then I start up the trail at a quick pace. At this point, I'm just creeped out. Then, as I'm walking up the hill, I hear a splash, and then something walking away. At this point, the screams had stopped. I was thinking, that's odd, and I began to jog. When I get to the road, I start to go down. It takes about 20 minutes to walk from the pond to the farm I was camping at. As I walk, I hear something snapping and stomping its way through the pine trees. I start to run and I don't look back at all. When I make it back, I asked my family what it could be, and they simply told me it was a fox. But I don't think it was that. I've listened to fox screams, and this was far too human-like. Not to mention, it was way too loud to be a fox. No one has been to the pond other than me that evening, and I don't know if I want to go back there at all. I'm worried about what I'll find if I do.